Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Laura Berlind, and I'm a proud member of the MPP class of 2002. I'm also the executive director of the HKS Alumni Shared Interest Group, the Adaptive Leadership Network. In this role, it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker and one of our school's most beloved teachers, Dr. Ron Heifetz. But rather than read you his bio or the impressive roster of influential world leaders he advises, I thought I would introduce him in a different way by describing the impact his work has had on me, and I know on so many of you. 21 years ago, and 21 years is enough time to start seeing the impact of the work you've done and the decisions that you've made. When I walked across this very stage in 2002 to collect my diploma, I had no idea that of all of the influential courses and experiences that I had inside these walls in those 2 years, there was one course in particular that was going to stick with me. That course was called Exercising Leadership, and I took it right over there in L140 with Dean Williams. It profoundly shifted the way I see the world's challenges and the way I wanted to deploy myself as a change maker. What I learned in that room followed me into every organization, every job, and every relationship, and every community I've lived in since then. It followed me to Wall Street and my first job in public finance. Then it followed me back to my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, and to the front lines of social justice, repair, and recovery work. And thank goodness it followed me when I took the role to build a bipartisan think tank in the state of Tennessee in 2015. In that same year, Ron Heifetz and a small group of dedicated faculty and then students launched the Adaptive Leadership Network. And they began holding annual conferences and later year-round opportunities for us to connect, learn, and continue to grow. These conferences and that network were a lifeline to me during some pretty dark years in Tennessee. So Ron, thank you for your commitment to our network. Thank you for your commitment to this entire community, to your former students, to your students of students. In this community, we have a place where we can find confidants, allies, and the sanctuary needed to do the long, difficult work of change. So without further ado, and with heartfelt gratitude on behalf of all of us who've been impacted by your work over 40 years, the stage is yours.
It's just good, great. Hi, everybody. I've had a very sweet morning having some of you stop by and getting to catch up. It's really an inspiration to hear some of your stories, see your faces, and to be reminded of some of the hard work we did in that classroom. So I was asked to talk a little bit about my more recent work, and so that's what I thought I might do today. I'm going to take maybe a half hour, a little bit more, and then open it up for some questions and discussion. And unfortunately, then I'm going to have to run off. I'm doing a workshop this weekend, so it's been scheduled a long time ago, so I'm going to have to run off before I'm really going to get a chance to say hello to many of you in person. But do write to me and be in touch. The problem that I have been working on for a long time could be summarized in this sort of way. Leadership generally is about tackling important, hard problems. And most hard problems, challenges, generally involve a multiple set of parties, each of whom have a stake and an interest in that challenge. And therefore, one of the very first tasks in leadership is a diagnostic task to assess who are the relevant parties in the ecosystem of any particular problem, And what sort of changes or challenges or losses or kinds of learning are we asking each of those different parties to do? In a sense, who needs to learn what becomes a central strategic question. Now, over the years, I have learned from my work with students that it's not simply an analytical problem to identify who are the relevant parties to a problem situation and what's at stake for them. It's not simply an analytical problem because each of us carries with us a host of inhibitions or impediments, sort of internalized barriers that make it very hard for us to explore certain parts of that ecosystem. Some of those parties who are centrally relevant to that problem are parties about whom we know very little, many times about whom we hold sort of two-dimensional images, and often hold quite a lot of generalizations that don't actually help us apprehend the world of those people. And in order to really engage people in collective problem solving across multiple boundaries, one has to begin to understand what is that world over there and what's the complexity in that world. Because then you have all sorts of more options for figuring out how to engage with those folks over there. And so recently, in the last years, I've been teaching a course started 20 years ago in January, and now I redesigned it as a semester-long course so I could breathe a little more into it. And in the last 2 years, taught it with a focus on sexism and anti-black racism, which has been an extraordinary frontier. And in that course, I've begun to develop a way of thinking about those barriers or impediments to our own curiosity and our own empathic imagination that would make it very difficult for us to apprehend key parties to a problem in the way that we need to if we're going to have a clear diagnostic understanding of the landscape, which will then inform all sorts of key strategic decisions about pacing and timing, sequencing, framing, allies, and so forth. So here's how I've begun to think about the internal landscape of a human being. It's a kind of a simple-minded psychology. All of us were born, and within at least 2 or 3 months of our birth, you can easily see that in young children. I see that in my 20-month-old grandson, that within months, he had a clear sense of agency. You know, he would point to this or point to that, say, this is what I want, this is not what I want. By a few months, he had a clear sense that this was his body and that's your body. Because he would move his arm and you wouldn't move yours. Or you would move yours, but his wouldn't move. So very quickly, he learned also a sense of the autonomy of his own body. And he also learned, all of us learned at a young age, that our emotions are ours and other people have theirs. And sometimes there's a lot of healthy mirroring going on where a child smiles and a parent smiles. You know, but the child learns very quickly that these are my emotions and you have your emotions, and you're not always smiling when I am, and I'm not always smiling when you're smiling. In fact, I may be crying and fussing and you may be smiling, and that doesn't get me to smile. You know, you gotta change me if you're gonna get me to smile again. And fourth, a child from the beginning, from early on, begins to have a sense of history. A sense that, you know, they remember you, and there you are again. And there's a sense then of the accumulation of a sense of process of life. Well, you know, I guess it's bedtime. You know, they begin to have their own clock and rhythm. So very early on, we have a self. We are a person. And of course, each of our selves are a little bit different because we're all a little bit different. But nevertheless, there is a self. But there is no identity. The child has no identity. The child doesn't really know. My grandson didn't know when he was 4 or 5 months old whether he's a boy or a girl. He didn't know if he was white or not white. He didn't know if he was a Jew or a Christian or Muslim or Zoroastrian or, or Hindu. But he did have a self. And so that's the very first idea, that we all have a self. And the self is, in a sense, a vessel that has the capacity to take in other worlds through identification. And so the child very quickly has the natural capacity, we all do, we're endowed with this social capacity, to identify with people in our surrounding. And so very quickly the child begins to identify, and those identifications become internalized, and over time the identification generates an identity. So the child identifies, keeps being told, you're a boy, you wear blue, no, you don't wear pink, you're supposed to be, these are the folks you're supposed to identify with, these are the folks you're not supposed to identify with. And slowly over time, the child begins to learn what does it mean to identify as a boy. Because there are males, other people who identify as boys or men in the environment that relate with that child a little bit differently than the people with a different gender identity. So the child begins to internalize that identity. And then over time, the child generates other identities. This particular child doesn't have any siblings, but if the child had siblings, the child would begin to internalize an identity as an older sibling, a sister or brother. And then the child begins to identify as a grandchild or as a nephew or niece. And then as the child continues to grow, the child begins to identify with other groups of people in the world. These are my classmates in preschool. This is my elementary school. This is my religious grouping, because everybody's telling me this is with whom I should identify. I have a natural talent at identifying with groups of people, and my heart is open. I'm full of curiosity. So if the people I love and who care for me tell me to identify with these people, I'm going to take those people into my heart as well. And so slowly over the early years of life, the child begins to accumulate a set of identifications with different groupings of people, each of which then over time becomes an identity. And indeed, the child begins to have in that vessel multiple identities. This, that, this, that, this, that, this. And by all of your ages, by all of our ages, we've all accumulated a lot of identities. Laura, who just introduced me, she had an identity as an executive director of this bridging organization, and before that, this and that, lots of different professional identities. She happens to be a mother, that's an identity. She's a woman, that's an identity. She's an American, that's an identity. She's a white person, that's an identification. And so forth, a religious identity, and she probably has a political identity. And each of us do. We all have multiple identities. So that's the second big idea. And the third is, each of these identities are social constructs. The child did not invent any of these identities. The child takes those identities to heart through the process of affection and trust, and by that natural internalization process. So that the child then becomes a walking collection of voices that switch on and off depending on the context. Depending on the context, the child will hear the mother's voice. This is how I'm supposed to be, in that identity. Okay, well, now we're going to this religious place to pray or be in community. Now that identity is activated. And now we're going over here to grandparents' house. Well, now that identity's activated. There are a lot of things I now can do that I can't do, because the grandparents are going to protect me, and so forth, from being a little more outrageous than maybe I'd ordinarily get to be. So over time, then the child internalizes all of these social constructions. And each of these social constructions itself was internalized through that community of people by their ancestors, and by the people in their lives. So each of these identifications that we carry is like a whole volume of an encyclopedia, filled with the accumulated wisdom, the accumulated traditions. In a way, to use a software analogy, the accumulated lines of code that instruct and inform and guide action within that identification. So that this is what it means to be a good girl. If this, then that. If this, then that. If this, then that. And of course, because there are multiple social constructions about what it means to be a good girl or a good boy, depending on whether or not you're born in Louisiana or Mumbai or Jakarta or Milan or many other places, those social constructions will be somewhat different. A lot of commonalities, but different. And the child then incorporates all of these different lines of code, most of it unconsciously. They just become part of who that child thinks that child is. Because the child doesn't distinguish self from all those identifications. If you ask a child, who are you, they'll begin to list their identifications. Just as we do when we're sitting on an airplane with a talkative person and they ask us who we are, and we begin to list our identifications. Well, I belong to this religious community, or I belong to this particular, usually they can see what gender, because most of us wear our gender identity as a sort of a obvious manifestation, but maybe not. Our ethnicity, sometimes our political identity, and so forth. All those nouns are the ways in which we know each other. But in this course, I've been helping people imagine into the proposition that each of us actually has a self that is more than and that holds all of these identities. And that therefore, they're not their identities. They have identities. Now, taking people from I am a woman to I have the identity of a woman, I am a man, I have the identity of a man. I am a Jew, I have the identity of a Jew, in my case. I am a white person or an American, I have that identity. If going from I have to I am to I have is a fairly significant psychological move. And what I hope to achieve by helping people make that move is that all of a sudden then these identities that are held close to the heart because they're the product of identifications with people who are close in our heart. All of a sudden these identities can become something, an object that the person can hold in their hand and then begin to turn 360 degrees and begin to then ask, what parts of that richness and tradition and heritage do I want to conserve? But what parts of those lines of code do I want to discard? And what innovation will enable me to bring the best of that identity into a more fruitful application in the current situation that I'm encountering? Now, it turns out that one of the big impediments to a person being able to do the diagnostic work of understanding the ecosystem of a challenge, the multiple parties around the circle, is that there are people in the background, voices that each of us carry, loyalties to these groupings, these identifications, who say to us, don't talk to those people. Don't listen to those people. We already know who they are. You can't possibly trust them. And because of those inhibitions, We never actually do the diagnostic work we need to do to apprehend the situation in its fuller complexity. And then that limits our options for taking action. Now, generally, if these identities are all held with some level of fluidity, we can switch from one relevant, salient identity to another, depending on the social context we're in. Again, all of you just walked back into a schoolhouse. Some of you left the schoolhouse, 40 years ago. Some of you left just 5 or 10 years ago, but you left a while ago. But the moment you just sit in that seat with me talking to you, all of those lines of code of what does it mean to be a student gets reactivated. All of those instructions of what it means to be a respectful student, to be a skeptical student, don't listen to that dude. Whatever those lines of code might be, all of that gets activated. Now, part of the richness of being a human being, moving from context to context, problem to problem, is our ability to draw on the wisdom of different identities depending on what's most fitting in that situation. It may be that the identity that's called forth, that's sort of automatically activated, like you're an executive, you've got this subordinate, and now you have to have a conversation. It may be that the lines of code of wisdom in how to have that conversation does not draw from your identifications as an executive and all the people who taught you how to be an executive. It may be that the wisdom really is going to come from your identification, your identity as a parent. And that applying that wisdom to that situation will be a lot more effective than applying the wisdom that comes out of that professional identity. So part of our ability to have the flexibility to interrogate a situation with fresh eyes and to begin to try to apprehend the complexity of the worlds of people relevant to that problem is dependent then on our ability to draw on different volumes of the encyclopedia. Try this page out of this volume. That's not seeming to work. Try this page out of this other volume. Now that flexibility to draw on our different identities with some fluidity gets sharply constrained by experiences of pain, and particularly identifications with people who have internalized historical pain. And so one of the impacts of pain, and even severe pain that we would call trauma, both at the individual level but historically, through our identifications with the community of people that have suffered, is that those identities all of a sudden get locked into primacy all the time. So that rather than having the freedom to be able to say, okay, this identity doesn't apply, let me try this one out, a particular identity is always locked in place. And that happens, I think, because our brains are designed to protect us from danger. And so when we've internalized danger, we're hypervigilant for any potential danger in the environment, and therefore are always scouring the environment with that in mind. And lose then the flexibility to say, maybe I ought to check out this situation and it's not as dangerous as I think. Maybe this person can be trusted even if they represent the group of privileged people who have done us so much damage. Maybe there's allies to be discovered there. Maybe there's a world of history and tradition and culture that I need to apprehend if I'm going to figure out how to negotiate and engage with it. So another part of this work is to help people figure out what to do with those identities, because in a sense some of those identities stick to the wall of the vessel. Instead of having the fluidity where the vessel, the self, can call on different identities or even question an identity, those identities end up sticking to the side, and until we free them up, people lose the full repertoire of the wisdoms they've internalized through the multiple identifications that they carry. So in working with this model, I then have developed a set of sort of practical directions for people to investigate, to figure out how in the midst of action to push the pause button and what I have called getting on the balcony, at least in relationship to themselves, and to take a time out and pause and spend some time trying to engage in some self-analysis or self-reflection, to try to figure out what is it that has stopped me from being curious? What is it that has stopped me from imagining that there is a world of value there that is worth taking in, that has closed my heart, that my powers of empathy have plummeted? And I think as people begin to go through in the practice of leadership moments where they have recognized that their curiosity and their empathy plummet, that can be then a red flag to cause a person to say, time out, I'm in danger, there's aspects of this landscape that I don't really understand because I can't go there. And I'd better take some time to do some internal work so that I can then go back out and interrogate that environment and try to apprehend the worlds of people who, on the one hand, I'm challenging, but on the other hand, I need to learn how to challenge properly. So one set of practices is what I have been calling renegotiating loyalties. That is the process of telling people with whom you identify, first in your heart, there's a lot of the cultural DNA that I honor and want to conserve. But some of it isn't going to work. And there's some new ways of thinking that is going to enable me to honor all the riches that you've given me, but with some changes as I continue to go forth. The process of renegotiating loyalties is a very complex emotional process, because what you're really asking people to do is refashion relationships. Some of these relationships are significant professionally, less significant sort of in a deep identification, in a first realm that I would call the professional domain, or the professional surrounding that many of us are in which we frequently have to go back and renegotiate expectations of the people with whom we identify professionally. It becomes more complex when you have to renegotiate expectations and loyalties with people in one's social surround. Friends, family, members of our community, all the living people that are in our lives, who expect us to behave a particular way, who look to us to represent a particular set of values or a particular set of identities, but with whom sometimes we have to depart. And then it's a whole nother level of complexity when you have to renegotiate loyalties with a third surround, ancestors. And indeed, many of us carry a lot of waters of our ancestors, the unresolved problems, the unresolved dilemmas in the life of our ancestors that are carried and held and carried down to us through stories, and that we've then internalized as part of our identity, as part of that community. So the renegotiating of loyalties in each of these domains, professional, social, and ancestral, to the degree to which it's relevant to the particular leadership problem context that I'm in the middle of, becomes I hope, a very powerful way of giving people the freedom to expand their capacity to investigate the situation. So part of it is renegotiating loyalties. A subset of that is selecting the waters you're going to continue to carry, and laying some waters down. Some of it involves finally accepting the horrible reality that there's nothing we can do to rectify the harms done to our ancestors. You can't change what happened. I can't change what happened to my grandmother, her family, or my line of ancestors. And accepting then the limitations of my power is a very powerful thing. To say, I can honor my ancestors, but I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do in this lifetime that is going to undo what happened to them. And then moreover, I think there are processes for engaging ancestors. For me, I took my mother back to the old country. We went to the villages where she visited until she was 12 years old in what's now the Ukraine, about 2 hours south of Lviv. She used to visit every summer from Germany to these villages in what was then Poland before World War II. And I had this amazing week with her, where all of a sudden I realized these ancestors who had been killed did not only have deaths, they also had lives. And all I had ever internalized was the death. I had never internalized that they were also alive. And so in this process of laying the past to rest, of setting these waters down, of asking my ancestors, what do you want from me? What am I supposed to do to honor you properly? I began to then set those waters down and create more freedom inside me to apprehend the realities of people whom I would not naturally feel curious or interested in. And it was this fabulous week because all of a sudden, my mother, who resisted for 5 years going, this was in 1999, she didn't want to go back. For her, it was just ugly, mud. But when we got there, the stories came out. All of her funny, her stingy uncle and her cousins, and these people were funny. And, my mother had a good sense of humor. And so, all of a sudden, the lives came alive. And then I related it to my early experience as a doctor when I was in training here and first went over to the Children's Hospital across the river and went up to the cancer ward and saw all these children. There's no justice on the cancer ward at Children's Hospital. But these children are not only dying, they're smiling, they're laughing, they are alive as long as they're alive. And so living in the injustice instead of also living in the lives of people required me to engage in some sort of process where I threw myself into the environment where my grandmother grew up and grandfather grew up. I laid in a meadow that my grandmother used to describe in this little village, not far from the Carpathian Mountains. She used to describe laying in this meadow, feeling cold air on her cheeks. And her favorite flowers, lilies of the valley and lilacs, would bloom each spring. Well, I happened to be visiting with my sister and my mother while the lilies of the valley and the lilacs were in bloom. And we found that meadow. And we felt the mountain air. And as I laid in that meadow, I asked my ancestors, so what do you want? How am I supposed to honor you? They did not say get revenge. They said, have a good life, be happy. We want you to be happy. I don't know what process any particular individual would go through in setting waters down. anybody who comes to the Kennedy School is carrying a lot of waters. Because otherwise you would have gone to the business school. But if you came to the Kennedy School, you care about things. And in part, the reason why you care about things is because you care about people who got hurt. And part of your life's work then has been to somehow, do justice in the face of their injustice. But to have the freedom to actually apprehend the full ecosystem of the challenge, one can't simply be listening to the voices of the people from that same side of the circle. Because, for example, if you care a lot about sexism, then there is a lot of work to do on sexism within various communities of women. But a lot of the work of sexism is in the communities of men, and in the way boys become men, and the way men reinforce certain norms of what it means to be a man, in their mutual re-identification modes in which everybody sort of reaffirms the identity, yes, you are a good practicing X, Y, and Z. And so if you are a woman, and most of the women in my class have experienced terrible things, it's pretty hard to take in a three-dimensional way the complexity and the richness and the beauty of a man's identity. The full range of cultural DNA inherited over countless generations of what it means to be a man. And what is it in that cultural DNA that you'd want to conserve? And what is it in that cultural DNA that you'd like to discard? And then what's the innovation that will bring the best of manhood into a more just treatment of women? And indeed, a more just treatment of other men. So you can't do that work without really coming to appreciate men. But that's pretty hard to do if you're carrying a lot of wounds. First from your own lifetime, and then amplified and complexified by all of the waters you're carrying from all the women with whom you've identified and their pains. So the process of freeing oneself up so that one can do then the diagnostic work of apprehending the worlds of others so that you can clarify what is it that you're asking of those people? What is it that you're asking them to learn? What is it in their cultural DNA that you're asking them to renegotiate? What does it mean to tell a man that he has to go back to his family dinner table and tell his father, I love you so much, my father. You've taught me so many things about life. Whenever I seek wisdom, I think of you or I call you. And yet, you really confused me when I came of age and you took me to a sex worker. And so, I think you really messed me up. And I want to tell you that, there's so much about being a man that I take from you, but some of what I want to take forward in my own life as a man is going to be different. Now that's a big ask. Who knows how to have that conversation? Frequently I ask the members of the LGBTQ community in my class to talk about what it meant for them to renegotiate their identifications within their families, because many of them have a lot of experience in going home and saying, what I understand to be a man or a woman is different than what you taught me. I'm not throwing it all away, but it's different. And then, sometimes that renegotiating of that loyalty will take years. And so there's actually a lot of life experience that many of us have had that we could share with each other to help people learn how to renegotiate these loyalties and set waters down. And then there's a third really important category of work, because people don't only have identifications. We also have experience, our own life experience, with our own wounds from our own life experience. And that too needs to be laid to rest. And so engaging people in the responsible task of repairing themselves so that they then have the freedom to practice leadership, again with curiosity and the ability to then take in the complexity of other people's worlds, people who may seem obnoxious to you, needs to get liberated. We need to be free to engage in that kind of diagnostic inquiry. And so these three tasks, renegotiating loyalties, laying waters down, and repair, are sort of the terrain that I've been engaging in thinking about how to do the internal work, how to do the internal work so that one can then practice leadership for the benefit of our communities. So let me stop there and open it up for a few questions. Let me see if there's anything last I want to say. Well, let me just open it up there, and then I think there's a couple of microphones. So. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I'll break the ice. Wolf, I identify as a German. I identify as a mid-career from 2003. And I also identify as a lawyer. And for me, words are very important always. And so I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I really like this idea about identifications, but I was always confused when it was also you use the word identity somehow in the same way. And for me, the word identification is a lot better because it's an active thing to do. And identity, perhaps specifically because in Germany we have a lot of discussions about identity politics, I do prefer identification. And this is why I think this is a very important step to do that. But I do prefer that as a scholar and also as somebody who does a lot of political discussions.
No, it's a wonderful question, wonderful question. So the key idea, one of the key ideas is that people's identities are generated through identification. Identification is the process that creates our various identities. Okay, so you have the identity of a German, but that accumulated over your lifetime through identifying with people in your country and its history and philosophy and literature and music and glorious history, really. Not only a painful history, but also a glorious history. And holding all of that complexity has been part of the work of your coming to grips with the complex identity or identification with people in Germany. Now, this is, I keep using both terms because I'm trying to help you begin to understand that something that we all hold very precious, our identity, is actually the product of identification, and therefore a social construct. That it's not you. All right, so now when does this become really practically important? If I'm trying to engage you, let's say I'm doing some sort of justice work, and I'm working with girls in a community who are enormously constrained in their options. because of the culture they're in. And you go to there as a school teacher or as a preacher, and you say to this girl, I think there are more options for what it means to be a woman than the options you're considering right now. And much of what development work looks like with girls is trying to help that girl realize that you don't have to be the girl that everybody told you you have to be. That you actually have some agency in relationship to this thing called your identity as a girl. You may even decide to self-reconstruct it as a non-girl identity. Or, I really love being a girl, but I'm not going to be the... but all of a sudden now, I have options. And I think, so it's important to use the word identity to understand that a lot of the changes you're asking of people to make, particularly around some of the more profound causes of justice, are where you are then tampering and challenging people's identities. And knowing, because what you're asking people to do is to reformulate their identity. To say, I'm still into this 98% of this cultural DNA, but this 2%'s got to go. And I'm going to now create this new hybrid with this enrichment of some innovation from someplace else. Now, that's what you're doing when you're challenging somebody's identity. And when people come back at you with a gun or a knife, sometimes in your back, it's because you're challenging something very precious to them, which is their sense of identity. Now, they don't distinguish self from identity. So if you say to if I go up on the street and go up to somebody and say, you're not a man, in some cultures, you're going to get punched in the face. So, because identity equals self-esteem. So, we need to know that that a lot of the changes we're asking of people is to evolve the cultural constructs of identity, which then means, from a practical point of view, that what we're asking people to do is to renegotiate their identifications, because those are the sources of those identities. Anyway, I hope that begins to explain the uses of these different terms that have an important relationship to each other. Yes, do you want to jump up to the mic? There's a, oh yeah, there's a, you have to go wait in line,
Yes,
I'm so sorry.
It's good seeing you again,
Yeah.
Doctor.
Hey, good to see you.
So just a simple little question. So what are some of the big things you've learned in the last 10 years that you would have liked to have incorporated into your course? And man, damn, here's some things that, going back 10, 15 years, I would have loved my students to have learned. So what are some of the things that, an older, more wiser and seasoned Heifetz can tell a Heifetz that was less seasoned and less wisdom, but still very wise for all of us 10, 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
So simple question.
Well, my oldest brother used to say to me, still does once in a while, do you have to be such an asshole? So some things don't completely change, but I do have more gentle moments. No, I mean, I've been trying to share with you during this half hour, what I hope is going to be a book on this internal framework that I wish that I had been able to talk about 10 years ago. I talked about it a little bit in my January course, but not with the same level of conceptualization that I have, that I continue to learn to do. And certainly issues of prejudice. I've become a lot more, I don't think I've become skilled at, but I've become a lot more skilled at being able to speak to. In the classroom, when I teach in that classroom, this fall course on sexism and anti-black racism, it's a fabulous experience to be a white, cis, heterosexual man walking into that classroom, because I'm nearly everybody's enemy. And then the class, because we use the class as a case, which some of you experienced, there's a constant learning process going on as I step on this landmine and then we step back and say, now look what happened. You know, is this your problem, my problem, or both of our problems? And so forth. So, you know, I've learned a lot about the ways in which people who are social activists defeat themselves. For example, I learned this last fall that people who are passionate advocates for social justice because they represent a deeply traumatized, pained community. In a classroom with people who represent the privileged community, as soon as the privileged people begin to talk about what they've internalized in regard to sexist attitudes or behavior or racist attitudes and behavior, demonstrating that they're actually beginning to learn and make progress and begin to talk about what they're renegotiating with what the lines of code they got from their families or their community. It's so painful. It's so painful for the a victimized community to listen to people emerge and talk about, you know, what they have internalized as a product of their privilege, that they can't listen. And instead of blessing these seedlings that are growing and nurturing them along and encouraging people to keep going and say more, they have a tendency to stomp all over the seedlings. Because instead of working the problem of mobilizing change on the other side of that table in the privileged community, instead of mobilizing the change, they immediately revert to another very, very important task, but it's a different task called repair. They want repair. They want recognition. They want people to know what they've gone through, all of which is in the interest of their own repair. Now, repair is a really essential task, not only for people within a community, but even across boundaries, as we're beginning to talk in America about various forms of reparation and repair. But repair, the repair agenda still is basically about drawing attention to your pain. Whereas mobilizing the other is inquiring into their world, where your attention is on them, apprehending them, being curious and engaging with them. So what I've begun to think about is how can I help people who are passionately committed, frequently for more than one lifetime, to work in social justice without engaging in action that is self-defeating. And that's a big frontier for me. Yes?
Yes. So Professor Heifetz, I graduated in 1998. I'm John Frank. And you haven't changed. So first I would like to know, am I speaking to Professor Heifetz's avatar? That's number one. And two, in reality, I'm starting to hear what you're saying, and I'm having trouble conceptualizing it on the national scale, where I'm seeing, let's say, for example, with the debt ceiling, and I'm seeing Biden and McCarthy. How could they actually, in reality, step on the balcony to say, hey, we're going to put this aside, who I am, because as you know, if they were to ever even to attempt that they're not, or they're, you see where I'm going.
Yeah, it would have relevance if Biden found himself unable to take in the various worlds of people that Kevin McCarthy is representing. Because he's negotiating with McCarthy, through McCarthy, into a whole world, complex set of worlds of people. And now Biden's very good at this. And one of the reasons why Biden's so good at this is that he learned early on in the Senate that you could passionately disagree with somebody and don't make it personal.
But my point is, I'm looking at this with the media, So
Yeah.
if one were to step aside and say, we need to negotiate with the Democrats or vice versa, the Republicans, we need to set aside our identity, not in those words, because that wouldn't play,
Yeah.
how that would reverberate throughout
Yes.
social media,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah.
That's it.
No,
Thank you.
that would be a real misapplication of what I'm saying. Yeah. First of all, everything I've told you is not something to go start doing with people. Everything I've told
Thank you.
is something to start doing with yourself when you find your curiosity or your empathy go to zero. It's about your ability to generate diagnostic integrity in the face of internalized forces and voices that prevent you from interrogating worlds or learning about worlds that you are allergic to. Now, what you do when you learn about those worlds, the strategy of change you then engage in, that's a whole other set of ideas. That's a very rich set of ideas. That's a very rich frontier. You know, the course I used to teach that many of you took is organized around that. You know, what are the technical versus adaptive components? How do you distinguish what's ripe from unripe? You know, how do you disaggregate the big issue into multiple small issues? How do you sequence and pace those issues? How to frame those issues? How to find allies within those other constituencies? You know, those become, there's a whole host of, you know, apprehending that complex communities of people with whom you are negotiating through this particular character. And that's not what I've been talking about. I've been talking about a prior so that you can go places where you would not ordinarily be able to go. And there are a lot of people in politics who can't even go there. Some of it's due to their professional loyalties. They're loyal to their constituents who tell them, don't go there. And they've reinforced that by two-dimensionalizing the people over there. So the interdependencies of a community are getting broken for the political ends that are in which there are benefits that accrue from polarization. So I'm trying to help people figure out how would you go back to your own constituencies and challenge them too, so that they can begin to understand the complexity of the world of those other people rather than two-dimensionalizing them so that you don't find any negotiation space. So yes, this is just for your own internal freeing up of your imagination. Yes, over here.
Hi, Professor Heifetz. I wanted to ask an external question. How has your teaching been impacted by external events, both within the country, in terms of our politics, but also internationally? When I met you 15 years ago in your class, where you were not as gentle, it seems, it felt, I remember that quite well. In fact, I was quite traumatized, but I met you as a young Muslim New York civil rights lawyer, and 9/11 was the big seminal event, if
Yes.
you remember.
Yes,
But
I
now
do.
it seems that the world has just, the country first has changed so much, and then since I've met you, I've been living overseas, and it seems like America is no longer the center of the universe, right? But also there are a lot of other things, and I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, so I'd really like to understand both how internally what's happened in our country and as well as what's happening in the world has impacted your teaching.
Well, it impacts it every day because, first of all, as you know, our students come from all around the world. Second, I've designed my courses from the beginning, 40 years ago, to be organized around the cases of the students themselves. So they're importing the world every day into the classroom. And the issues that are ripening in the environment are alive in the classroom. I had Russians and Ukrainians in my course this last year. So, for example, or I don't think I would have designed this course to focus on anti-black racism and sexism if it hadn't been for George Floyd getting murdered, and asking myself, is there something I can do to address this issue from my particular vantage point as somebody, as a student of leadership. So I mean, I think it's a very permeable boundary, and but that does two things. On the one hand, the body of theory continues to develop and clarify, the body of theory that I've been developing, both for the contextual analysis and the internal analysis, as a product of engaging with cases from around the world and saying, wow, well, now what can I come up with for that? And and then how to teach to those issues when those issues are ripe and alive in the classroom and volatile and hot. For example, in the last few years, what I think it's a real blessing that finally women feel the permission and at least the minimum threshold of safety to speak to the violations they've experienced. And so that's really alive. And the people in my class who've experienced racism or other forms of prejudice, could be Asian or black, other forms of anti-Muslim prejudice, people are giving voice. Now it means that we have a classroom of angry people. And most of my colleagues don't know what to do about that. But for me, that's our job, to help people figure out how to take all this fury and outrage, this fire, and build the piping so that it'll actually turn the turbines of change. To have the self-discipline and self-awareness so that they can then be strategic and make things change rather than just having that fire cause them to melt down and burn out. And that's a real problem. Now, in your particular case, I happen to be going tonight, as soon as I leave here in a few minutes, to Washington to fulfill a commitment from a year ago to do a 2-day workshop for the American Muslim community, a foundation that's bringing together these active voices. Now, I've worked in a lot of different religious communities, but I haven't worked in very much in the Muslim community, a little bit, but not much, and I'm going to learn a lot this weekend. And I think it's going to be a very moving experience. If I hadn't gone home with my mother, I would not have learned some of the things I would have needed to learn inside so that I can fully internalize, to take in with genuine heart and curiosity the complexity of the issues they represent, including how then to challenge them effectively. Because, I can't stop challenging people. That's just... Yes.
Professor Heifetz, my name is Rhonda Jackson.
Yes.
I took your class 20 years ago.
Yes,
and
I recall.
I don't remember any of this ancestral laying down of waters conversation.
Yeah, it was new. This is new stuff.
It might have been helpful. For me.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask you, I encountered
I apologize that I learned so slowly.
I wanted to ask you because I encountered some of this ancestral work since I've left here 20 years ago, and the great teachings of West African leaders, Malidoma and Sobonfu Somé, and German psychologist Bert Hellinger. And I wanted to know what and who has kind of brought this. Maybe it's just come from your own experience in going home with your mom. What has brought that kind of teaching into what you're trying to do? And also, how has it been received? Because when I've tried to do some of this work in Western context, it's very different. It's very different for people to think about from a leadership and a lot of different aspects of their life.
And I think by and large I've learned from my students, because my job is to take in their stories. I can't begin to figure out what options they might consider if I don't take in their stories. Right now, I've taught about 250 students this year. I've taken a lot of stories. I'm kind of stuffed. I need a break. So I'm not going to teach in the fall because so, you know, you're taking people's stories and it cracks open this, you know, this place in your heart that's, you know, that's kind of closed in this place, and you keep just discovering. So, I mean, I think largely that's been the process throughout my career, is the stories that, fortunately, I mean, the great blessing for me in teaching here when I started at 32 years old, I'm now 72, is that because we have a very large mid-career class, and even the pre-career students or the early career students already have a few years of experience, and because I designed the classes around students' own cases. From the beginning, I was learning from, you know, what did I know? But I was learning from the richness. So I'd been teaching in an undergraduate, you know, it would have been the blind leading the blind. Nobody would have been able to say to me, I don't see how that idea applies. Okay, well, I guess it doesn't, so let me come up with a different one. And so really it's, you know, whatever work I've done is a product of the contributions of your story and many other people's stories over the years. Thank you. Maybe one more question, and then I think I'm going to have to stop. I wish I could spend all day with you. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Heifetz. Always a pleasure to listen to you. As you were talking of renegotiating loyalties or laying the water to rest, there are some raw nerves that were. So as we try to support our kids as they grow up, exercise their agency, and that love and affection that keeps you in the game as you try to renegotiate your loyalties to the ancestors. But sometimes it feels like a stampede going on. How do you, a stampede, like people are just running and you need to just try and, so how do you keep yourself steady as you are in that space and not avoid the work? What could you do in that space? Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and it's a good place for me to close, because I have three basic categories of what I call anchors, ways to anchor yourself. The first is, I think you need a sanctuary, a physical location where you can go to restore yourself to yourself. And it may be a place where you pray in community. It could be, you know, a bench on a river where you sit. It could be a room in your house where you meditate. It could be a particular seat at a bar where you watch yellow liquid swirl in ice. I'm not recommending any particular, but I think we need sanctuary. And we have to treat it not as a luxury, but not as an expendable item, but as a necessity. In the same way that when you moved to Boston to study, you bought a winter coat. You need a winter coat here. And to practice leadership or to work these tough issues, you need these anchors, of which I think the first is a sanctuary. And second, I think you need practices, regular practices, that can also help you restore yourself to yourself. For me, a major practice for a big chunk of my life was taking my kids and picking up my kids most days from school. And that for me was hard to do because, you know, I'm full of self-importance, and it was hard to leave my office. And then I'd run to school, and I'd get there, and I'd be at the back of the line to pick them up in a line of cars, and I'd have my cell phone in one hand and a dictating machine in the other, working, and finally, and say, what am I doing here? I'm the only man here. You know, the line of cars with their children that drove past me going the other direction, 1 out of 17 cars had a woman in the first year I did this, when the children were in first and second grade. But then I'd get to the front of the line and I'd see these little faces and I'd hear these little voices. Now, in the first year, it would take me, 3 or 4 minutes to transition. After a few years, I transitioned fast. I'd be out of my mind till I saw those faces, and then I'd be anchored in a new world of meaning. It didn't discount the meaning of my work. My work is deeply meaningful to me. But it gave me another world of meaning to be anchored in, so I wouldn't get lost. And when they started to drive, I lost that anchor. I had to develop another practice. So we all need practices. It could be going to the gym, it could be learning poetry, it could be learning how to play the guitar, it could be singing in a choir. You know, there are a lot of different practices that we need, I think, on a regular basis. And again, I don't think these are expendable luxuries. It could be a friend that you have tea with routinely around a table. Don't cancel. And then the third is, I think you need confidants. And I hope what this reunion does is reconnect you with some people that you forgot you had as resources in your life. Because you can be confidants to each other, because most of you are operating hundreds or thousands of miles away from each other in different environments. You don't have any competing stakes. And you can just listen for a half hour and help that person make sense, you know, of what's going on, and help that person figure out how to go back into that meeting the next day with, you know, a little bit more degrees of freedom. And I think it's important to have confidants. And I think for those of people working incredibly hard to produce this event for all of you, I think the deepest prayer that we all have is that you will rekindle some connections with people that you then hold on to. In the way that Odysseus roped himself to the mast, you know, to survive going through treacherous waters. You need each other to help you move through, just as you say, the overwhelming currents of that will cause you to be trampled upon during this stampede, or drown, to use a different metaphor. And so that would be my prayer for all of you, is that you will take care of yourselves, but also take care of each other.